You won't believe it when a judge humiliates Chuck Norris in public court and then places him in handcuffs. Chuck Norris was no stranger to pressure. During his martial arts career, he took on some of the most difficult cases in the nation while serving years in illegal trenches. However, today was different when he entered Judge Howard Gates's courtroom, a man known for his witty remarks and unpredictable decisions. He knew this hearing wouldn't be typical, a serious transgression of government ethics that may have affected more than a few careers. Norris had come prepared, but what he hadn't anticipated was the animosity radiating from the defendant, a wealthy developer with close political ties who was accused of using state funds for his private projects. Judge, from the bench before he even said a word, as he got closer to the plaintiff's table, Gates hardly looked up. Instead, he slowly turned to a file, allowing the courtroom to sit in silence. Not just procedural silence, but the kind of silence intended to make a statement. And then, without turning to face him, he spoke. "Mr. Norris, I'm assuming you had something important prepared today, or should we just move on to the part where you wasted my time?" The defendant's legal team was mostly the source of the few giggles that echoed through the back of the courtroom. "I think the evidence will speak for itself in this case of taxpayer money being misused, and it is my responsibility to make sure the facts are presented fairly." Norris disregarded them, and he had suffered worse than you, Honor, because that has never served as the basis for a pointless case before. Gates leaned back in his chair and figured out that taxpayer dollars were being wasted. However, Norris's jaw tightened, but he kept. The judge's hostile behavior begins, his tone steady, respectfully. "Your Honor, I would hardly call felony corruption charges frivolous for a brief moment." Their eyes met his cold and calculating, Norris's unwavering, but to continue he cut him off again. "Mr. Norris, spare me to lectures. Just get to the point. I don't have all day to entertain whatever grandstanding you have planned." A murmur spread through the gallery. The courtroom wasn't packed, but those present were alert, sensing something was off. Judges could be tough, but this was personal. Chuck took a slow breath, recalibrating. He knew what was happening. Gates wanted him off balance. He wanted to control the tempo, to put him on the defensive. But Chuck Norris wasn't about to give him that satisfaction. He picked up a folder from the table, flipping it open. "Your Honor, I'd like to direct the court's attention to Exhibit A. These financial records clearly demonstrate Mr. Norris." Gates interrupted. "Do you always insist on drowning people in paperwork, or is this just your way of compensating?" That one landed. The shift in the room was instant. The defense attorney smirked. A few reporters in the gallery exchanged glances, but Norris didn't flinch. He had learned a long time ago that men like Judge Gates thrived on intimidation. The only way to beat them was to never let them see you rattle. He paused just long enough to make a statement without saying a word. Then he set the folder down and clasped his hands together. "Your Honor, if you prefer to continue making this personal, I'm happy to request a recess while we address any professional concerns you may have." It was subtle, not aggressive, not disrespectful, but pointed a clear warning that he wasn't going to roll over. The judge's lips curled slightly. Was that amusement, annoyance? It was hard to tell, but he wasn't done. Not yet. "Oh, I don't have concerns. Mr. Norris, I just know a weak case when I see one." This time the reaction wasn't just murmurs. A few gasps. Someone whispered something under their breath. This wasn't how a judge was post-conduct. A hearing. Chuck could feel the way to the room. Shifting eyes moving between him and Gates, like a tennis match, but he wasn't going to engage in a shouting match. That's what he wanted instead. He adjusted his jacket, straightened a few papers, and looked him dead in the eye. "Then I suppose we should let the evidence do the talking." But as he spoke, he caught something in his expression. Not just arrogance, not just condescension. There was something else, a flicker of something deeper. Like a man, Chuck Norris discovers the corruption connection. They were interested in the case's result, and he realized that this was more than mere courtroom showmanship. Judge, not only was Gates acting aggressively for sport, but he also had something to conceal, which Chuck was unaware of. Despite Chuck Norris's extensive experience in the ring and in courtrooms, this was a unique circumstance. Judge. Not only was Gates ruling from a bench, but he was also engaged in a calculated, deliberate attempt to discredit him in front of the entire courtroom. However, he could feel the weight of his stare as he proceeded with his arguments, and he could almost see Gates waiting to strike with every word he said. These documents show a clear discrepancy in the funding allocations the defendant's company received, nearly triple the amount approved in the original budget, and none of it was accounted for in the state records, he said, keeping his tone measured, with a slight curl of his lips and a slow tapping of his fingers on the bench, as if it were daring him to continue. He turned slightly, gesturing towards the projection screen where the financial statements were displayed. Now, if you look here, Mr. Norris, Gates has a cut in his voice with the same arrogant edge. We've seen enough figures for one day, and I really hate to interrupt your presentation. Chuck gave him a quick glance before turning back to the screen. He wasn't even attempting to conceal it anymore. Your Honor, with all due respect, these numbers are the foundation of the case, right? He said, laughing, but I don't see anything that justifies wasting the court's time in this way. There was that word again, wasting time. He was attempting to bury this case before it even got off the ground when he heard the prosecution team shifting and exchanging glances behind him. They sensed that something was off as well. He looked up and said, Your Honor, I'd like to submit a motion to deny silence. Norris tightened his hold on his pen and turned to the next page in his file. I haven't even said the motion yet, but I can already tell you it's not going anywhere. Gates leaned forward, resting his elbows on the bench. Let's face it, Mr. Norris. This whole case is based on conjecture and a little creative accounting, and now you're accusing the defense lawyer of corruption. A middle-aged man wearing a blue suit grinned, telling him that Gates had done all the work and he didn't need to say anything. With a deep breath, Norris said, Your Honor, are you refusing to allow me to move before hearing its contents? Oh, I. Pause would be excessive, and I would not engage in this circle act any longer. The courtroom was not just tense, but it was also changing. The evidence that changes everything. Heads were twisting and eyes were darting, and even the reporters in the rear were writing more quickly. Chuck noticed that one of the jurors was a woman in her 50s wearing a dark blazer. Her brows were furrowed and her lips were pressed together. She wasn't the only one who noticed that arrogance draws attention, or that it squares his shoulders. Very nicely, Your Honor. Then let's move on to the next piece of evidence. He turned back to the screen and clicked to the next slide. According to this document, which was obtained through subpoena, Mr. Norris's tone changed this time, and he stopped and looked at him critically. Gates had changed from leaning back in his chair. His hair had fallen out, his hands were clasped, and his mouth was thin. He approached the bench, but it wasn't a request. He hesitated, put his papers down, and walked towards him in the courtroom quietly. When he got to the bench, he lowered his voice just enough so that only Chuck could hear. I would strongly advise you to change the course you're taking here, he said. Some fights aren't worth having. And then he carefully and deliberately leaned an inch closer. Excuse me, Mr. Norris, but he inclined his head slightly. I don't mind passing judgment too quickly. A muscle twitched in Gates's jaw, and he turned to return to his table, but that moment gave him all the information he required. Chuck Norris went back to his seat, his thoughts racing. This wasn't just a power move, that was a warning, a veiled threat disguised as judicial authority, he said. But why had he entered this courtroom expecting a pushback, maybe even hostility? But this was something deeper, Judge. Instead of being biased, Gates was defending someone or something. He had a stack of papers and a neutral demeanor. The prosecution team moved next to him, waiting for him to react, but he didn't. Instead, he raised his chin and turned to face the court. Your Honor, I'd like to The shocking arrest in the courtroom carry on, giving my proof. Gates didn't answer right away. Instead, he waited for a moment to decide how far to push before moving forward, albeit in a brief manner. Norris didn't address the jibe. He just reached for the next file. The defendant and the city's planning board signed this contract, which details the project's estimated costs. You'll see that they come to little over $2 million. He paused and then carefully placed another sheet on the projector. But this time, it was an internal ledger from the defendant's business that revealed the actual amount of money transferred was almost twice that amount. He then placed a third document, the approval signature, signed off by Judge Howard Gates. But he hesitated, allowing the moment to pass. The courtroom didn't simply change. There was a flurry of activity with eyes darting and pen scratches, the defense counsel stiffening his smug look, and the judge was wiped clean. His countenance was unreadable, and for the first time since Chuck entered this courtroom, Gates remained motionless. After a brief period of quiet, Norris said, "Your Honor, would you mind explaining why your signature appears on an unauthorized financial transaction involving a calculated risk?" He still didn't have the whole story, but what he did have was enough to rock the ground beneath him. Gates finally shifted in his chair a little, pressing his fingers together. He said that whitening his knuckles slowly was not admissible. Norris tilted his head, allowing the fact that it was obtained improperly to sink in. My office subpoenaed this document, and his nostrils flared. Because of the improper handling, I'm declaring it inadmissible, and this court won't consider it. This time, the shift wasn't just in the gallery, it was everywhere. The jury, the stenographer, even the bailiff, and everyone was watching, including Cross's arms. You understand that this is a public hearing, that the media is present, and that everyone in this room just saw you make a critical statement, but his tone is calm. Financial evidence that was inadmissible without cause caused a muscle in his jaw to jump. But Mr. Norris didn't move or blink. He then slowly sat down, and that's when he did something that made all the difference. He reached into his case, took out a small recorder, set it on the table, and hit play. A low, gruff voice filled the courtroom, unmistakably. "Take care of it. I don't care how the recording crackled," then continued to ensure he didn't get his aftermath and justice served quiet about those ledgers' utter, oppressive silence, Judge. As the real game was about to start, Gates didn't need to move, breathe, or look at him because everyone in the room had already heard him. The recording ended, leaving only a thick, suffocating silence in its wake. No whispered rumors, no murmurs. Just a stun. The defense attorney finally blinked, losing his composure as the smirk vanished and was replaced by something more akin to dread. He looked at his client, the wealthy developer whose empire had been built on backroom deals and political favors. The defense attorney looked pale as everyone realized that Judge Howard Gates had just been caught. Chuck Norris remained motionless, his eyes fixed on the recorder as if daring to challenge what had just played, but he couldn't cross the courtroom. "Judge." His throat was cleansed by Gates. "Mr. Norris. I'm not sure how you got that recording, but Your Honor." He abruptly stopped speaking. "The real question is, who are you talking to with his fingers in fists?" "This is ridiculous," he snapped, "and your grandstanding pandemonium is causing the entire hearing to sink into disorder," Norris said in a light, even amused tone once more. "I would say that this is clarity at last. We have some transparency in this courtroom." The tension increased even further, so Norris took a moment to relax and perspire before reaching for another document and slid it across the table. "Your Honor, this is a transcript of a wiretap that was lawfully obtained during our investigation." He tapped the top of the page, and it confirms everything you just heard on that recording, Judge. Didn't touch his chest, but he did gaze at the page. Rose noticed his respiration suddenly becoming very rapid. Although Norris's voice was firm, the weight of the words made the room seem smaller. "We'll take care of him." Norris turned slightly to face Officer Reynolds, the BFF. "Would you please read the highlighted passage aloud?" The Bath hesitated before picking up the transcript. Nobody in the gallery took a sharp breath, but if Norris does have anything substantial yet, I'll make sure it never enters a courtroom. Chuck clasped his hands together. "I would like to provide this as proof, Honorable Judge." Gates made a slight movement towards the exit, but it was enough for the room to see that, for the first time, he was considering anything other than his own conceit. Escape. However, it was too late for that motion to be rejected. His voice was a bark. An eyebrow was raised by Norris. "I apologize. This hearing is done." Gates went on a little too loudly, "and I won't let the judge handle it." The Gates. "I wasn't asking for your permission," Norris remarked smoothly, and then he made the move he had been waiting for. He turned to face the back of the courtroom and offered the smallest, suest nod. Footsteps sounded against the polished floor as a door opened, and the judge was introduced in a firm, authoritative voice. "Howard Gates, you are being held under arrest." As the cameras clicked and reporters scrambled for their phones, gasps emanated from every corner of the room. Even the powerful defendant, who had assumed that this trial would be merely a formality, appeared truly shocked when the jury paused, as though he could make everything vanish by remaining still. Gates sat there with his eyes locked on a single point on his bench, without turning or even speaking. But reality had already caught up with him. As two uniformed officers stood on either side of the judge, Chuck Norris stayed seated. One reached into his pocket, while the other produced a pair of handcuffs. "That's ridiculous." Gates muttered, "You have the right to remain silent, but for the first time in your career, Judge Howard Gates actually was." The sound of the metal clicking shut was deafening, and the cuffs that were locked around Gates' wrists sealed his fate in front of the very people he had ruled over for years. The once dominant figure behind the bench now sat with a mask of disbelief, his expression frozen. The courtroom had burst into stunned murmurs, and reporters scrambled to record the moment, their hands moving furiously across their notepads, even the jury. Due to their obligation to maintain objectivity, they could conceal their shock. Chuck Norris remained seated with his face unreadable. This was about justice, not about celebrating or seeking retribution. When Gates eventually found his voice, he said, "You can do this." His words were barely audible, almost like a whisper, as though he didn't believe them himself. Did the officer holding his arm not flinch? "You are being arrested for obstruction of justice, conspiracy to commit fraud, and abuse of judicial power. You will have the opportunity to speak with any legal representatives. This is a disgrace," since Gates yanked against the cuffs while his face flushed. Norris finally straightened his jacket and stood up in this courtroom. For the first time, his haughtiness gave way to something more akin to fear as the officers dragged him to his feet, but he resisted. "This is political." Norris shook his head. "This is accountability." The room fell silent once more, the end of a lifetime of unbridled power in an instant. Gates's face contorted, his jaw tightening, and he looked around the gallery, hoping for a supporter or someone who would come forward and call out this error. However, no one moved because it was an error, and a few feet away, the defense lawyer had turned white. His breathing was shallow, and his fingers were gripping the edge of the table. The man who believed that his influence could protect him wasn't doing much better. When Norris turned back to face the judge, his eyes lingered on him for a brief moment before he added, "If you have anything to say, I'd suggest you save it for your arraignment," in a calm, measured voice. When Gates ran out of things to say, his mouth opened and closed. The officers started chasing him towards the side. "Exit," But before they could get to the door, the developer finally heard him say, "Wait." His chair scraped the floor as his eyes darted up and down between Gates and Norris. "Since things are going out of control, we can find a solution. There's no need for this type of public show. Let's be sensible." Norris arched an eyebrow and said, "Work something out." The man gulped and was clearly unraveling. He took a step closer after Nora examined him for a while. "You seem anxious, Mr. Lawson." His mouth opened, but no words emerged. He cocked his head, so he shook his head, faking a nervous laugh. "No, this is just absurd. Do you really think Gates is guilty?" "Norris, did you leave the question unanswered before speaking? Will you remain silent?" When the door closed behind him, the officers moved once more, guiding Gates through it. The weight of the moment settled over the courtroom like a heavy fog. This was no longer just a case. It was the dismantling of a system that had been shielded for far too long, and Chuck Norris wasn't finished yet. He looked back at the jury, at the judge's vacant seat, then at the defense table. "Although I think the trial is not yet over." Everyone in the room realized that this was just the beginning, and the courtroom felt lighter, as if the burden of years of corruption had been instantly removed. The shock of realizing that Gates had been taken away in handcuffs remained in the air like the last note of a symphony. After rearranging the documents in front of him, Chuck Norris returned to his seat. The trial was still ongoing, but the largest barrier had just been lifted, so he focused on the defense table. Charles Lawson, the developer, had been eerily quiet. His customary arrogance had given way to something colder and more calculated, and he was still attempting to determine the extent of the damage. The extent to which his safety net was torn away. With the wheels churning in his mind, Norris leaned forward a little. Without Gates on the bench, his legal team would have argued the case on its own merits, and they had none. "Mr. Lawson, would you rather talk about a plea, or would you like to carry on with today's proceedings? This witch hunt has his jaw clamped." Norris smiled slightly and said, "No, Mr. Lawson, this is justice." He sneered and shook his head, leading one to believe that if one dishonest judge alters anything, it means you've won. Norris took his time to react, allowing the moment to sink in. "I believe this indicates that the system is still in place, since he finally stated that, regardless of how strong someone believes they are, the truth will always find them." Lawson let out a short exhale, but he was at a loss for words. The judge's chair was still empty, but it made no difference because the case was out of his hands. The prosecution team looked at each other, and one of Norris's colleagues pushed in, suggesting that now would be a good moment to press for a settlement. Norris gave it some thought and noticed the change in the atmosphere of the room as the jury watched and waited, having just witnessed something they would never forget. However, he wasn't going to let this end with a whisper, so he began, then stopped and corrected himself to the presiding judge who would now handle this case. "Given what had happened today, I would like to formally request that we move forward with new evidence. It is obvious that we require a thorough investigation to determine the extent of this malfeasance." A whisper echoed around the courtroom. Norris went on to condemn, "I'll ask you again. Do you want to talk? Gates was only a part of the issue. If my team could find out, it would suggest that more and more names are being found of people who believed they were untouchable." He turned to Lawson. Lawson sat rigidly, drumming his fingers against the table as he considered his alternatives. "If I do, I want protection." He finally sighed. Norris nodded slowly. "Then you had better start talking." When the bay called for order and the trial got ready to begin, the reporters in the back of the room scrambled to get their stories out, because this wasn't just another case. This was history, and it was only the beginning. Chuck Norris had just sent a message to everyone watching. No one is above the law. The courtroom wasn't the same place it had been an hour ago. The balance of power had changed, the walls that protected the powerful had begun to crack, and